Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I am your host for this session, Lauren Duff, and today we are joined by Aishwarya Sinha and Jenna Maynard Baker to talk about pay equity and the connection between pay equity and domestic violence. And I'm gonna go ahead and start by diving right into this issue to ask Aishwarya to kind of level set for us. What do we mean when we talk about pay equity? And with today being Equal Pay Day, what does that day represent for this issue?
Sure, Lauren. So when we're talking about pay equity, we're talking about pay for work that is of equal value, that requires the same skill level, that requires the same education level, and it's equal work and for an equal pay, regardless of gender, race, or any other factor. So it's not just about making sure that people in the same job are paid equally, but it also means that we address the systemic barriers that have kept women, especially women of color, in lower paying positions in our in any industry. And so equal pay, what it actually means, it's an annual marker that shows how far into the next year women must work to earn what men made in the previous year. So today is Equal Pay Day for white women in the United States, but the reality is so much different for communities of color. For Black women, I think Equal Pay Day does not happen until July, and for Latinas, it doesn't happen until October of this year. So that means that while the average white woman is catching up by March, a lot of communities and women of color, they're still working an extra 6 to 10 months to earn the same as white non-Hispanic men.
In
Lauren,
the
I think you're just muted.
So thank you so much, Aishwarya. Yeah, that's such a great point to remind folks that Equal Pay Day falls differently for different groups of women. And if folks are interested in seeing what those dates are, Aishwarya just published a great blog article for today for Equal Pay Day that you can find on the PCADV blog, and we'll put a link in the chat for folks that are interested to check out that piece. And so, Aishwarya, why is Equal Pay Day such a critical issue for domestic violence? There might be folks out there wondering, why is PCADV talking about this issue? Why is this issue such a priority for us? So can you explain where that intersection lies?
Sure. So equal pay day and pay equity is not just about like fairness in the workplace. It's basically a lifeline for survivors of domestic violence and even for advocates who we know might sometimes be survivors themselves. So PCADB sees the connection in two ways. When someone is being paid unequally and there's wage gap, we know that it creates conditions like poverty, housing insecurity, or even harmful gender norms that are known risk factors for someone to experience domestic violence. And when domestic violence exists and someone is being paid unequally, barriers are created that really makes it challenging for survivors to leave an abusive relationship and find independence. Let's say a survivor is working full time but is still earning less than their male counterparts. So they have fewer resources to leave. And even if they leave, they're still struggling with resources like housing, childcare, legal assistance, even the basic necessities. So this isn't just an economic issue for PCADV, this is more of a safety issue. Without financial independence, many survivors are forced to return to abusive situations simply because they cannot afford to leave. And from the prevention side, it is really necessary to ensure women and communities receive fair wages because that reduces the financial disparities. That gives someone the power to make independent choices about their safety and well being.
Yeah, thanks so much, Astoria, for making that connection. And I'm sure that some folks that are familiar with domestic violence have heard this statistic before that financial abuse occurs in 98% of domestic violence relationships. And so obviously that's a big factor as well that pay equity ties into. Can you talk a little bit about financial abuse as well and how that can impact survivors' ability to regain control of their lives and their safety.
Sure. So, like you said, Lauren, financial abuse happens in 98% of domestic violence relationships, but it is the least talked about form of abuse. And financial abuse can basically look like gaining power and control over someone, and it can look like economic control, make abusers controlling access to money, sabotaging someone's opportunity to leave, or sabotaging their employment opportunities so they cannot be independent, creating debt in someone's name. So even if they try to leave, or even if when they leave, their credit history is not fit enough to get a house on their own, to get an apartment on their own, to even maybe there's so much control that there's no access to their own credit cards or their own bank accounts, and money is limited. So these it can look very different, but the crux of it is power and control.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to share something that you wrote in the blog article that I found really powerful. You said that pay equity is much more than an unfair paycheck. It's a systemic barrier that traps survivors in abusive relationships and prevents someone from leaving. It's not just about fairness, it's about survival. And I just think that that example of how financial abuse ties into this issue, and the fact that, it's difficult for anybody, no matter how many resources they have available to them, to leave an abusive relationship. And if you don't have any resources to have an alternative, safe place to go and stay, to be able to afford your own vehicle and transportation, to be able to afford to feed your kids on your own without the support of that abusive partner, that it just makes that decision to leave an abusive situation so much more difficult. As you said, it really adds such a big barrier to being able to find safety. Um, so thanks so much for making that connection for us. I think it's really important for folks to understand, like, just why this is such a critical issue and initiative for us at PCADV. And so I read recently that according to the AP, women working full time earned 83 cents on the dollar compared to men in 2023, which is down actually from a historic high of 84 cents in 2022. This was surprising. While we have a ways to go to achieve pay equity, the trend has been up. So, can you talk a little bit about why we have now seen the wage gap widen for the first time in our generation?
Yeah, so definitely I'll shed some light on it. Yeah, so for the first time in 20 years, like you mentioned, the wage gap, instead of getting smaller, it widened, and instead of the 84 cents, it actually fell down to 83. Or if you read like different reports, it's actually 82.6 right now. So one of the biggest reasons for this shift was that there was a huge job losses during the pandemic, but that kind of hit women dominated industries the hardest. So, sectors like education, healthcare, even social services, where women do make up the majority of the workforce, those jobs haven't recovered at the same rate at, let's say, the recovery that has happened in jobs for male dominated fields like tech and construction. So, their wages have grown faster, but since because this the women dominated sectors have not been able to gain back the same momentum, we're seeing a lot of women exiting the workforce, and we're seeing the numbers go down. And from the recent research, what I've read is another issue is the return to in-person work. So we know that many women of color are more likely to have caregiving responsibilities, which makes it like very hard for someone to return to workplaces that don't offer flexibilities of hybrid or remote work. So if there's no remote work options, many women have been pushed out of higher paying positions, or have been forced to reduce their work hours from full-time to part-time jobs.
Yeah, thanks for giving some insight into what we're seeing happening right now. It's just unfortunate that we are seeing this bit of a backslide in pay equity. I also wanted to ask you about some national organizations, as well as PCADV at a state level, have been conducting salary surveys of domestic violence service providers to assess some of the challenges that local domestic violence programs are facing when it comes to staffing. Can you talk to us a little bit about those findings of those studies, and how that intersects with the gender wage gap and pay equity?
Sure. So, like the national survey shows, and PCADV is also conducting its own salary study for programs. We're seeing that domestic violence service providers are often underpaid despite working in such a high stress, life-saving position. And unfortunately, many frontline advocates could actually earn more in retail or customer service than they're earning working in shelters or crisis interventions. And there's also a serious issue for staffing. A lot of programs are offering low wages because of the limited funding, which is leading to high turnover, burnout, and difficulty attracting experienced professionals in this field. And what we're seeing is this is trickling down to the way survivors are being served, because when programs don't have enough staff, survivors wait longer for services and shelters are understaffed. Even like crisis hotlines go unanswered. So the irony is that we expect domestic violence organizations to advocate for economic empowerment for survivors, yet we're not ensuring that advocates themselves are financially secure and are getting paid what they deserve. So definitely it's a big issue, and pay equity in our own field should be a priority if you're hoping to continue to provide like good, reliable services to survivors.
Yeah, thank you, Aishwarya, for that. There is such a direct line from, what funding domestic violence organizations get to how much they are able to pay staff to do this very, difficult and important work that is truly life-saving to, how that impacts survivors that are served. In fact, in a single day in 2023, there were 823 unmet requests for services across the state of Pennsylvania. And that is due to a lack of financial resources. But this isn't a new problem. This is something that our movement has been dealing with for a long time. So, Jenna, I'm hoping that you can talk with us a little bit about the chronic underfunding of domestic violence services, and how that a little bit more about that connection between the issue of pay equity and not being able to pay a living or thriving wage to advocates impacts staffing challenges, and then trickles down to how survivors are served in Pennsylvania.
Absolutely. And with policy in general, you have to kind of unpack the history to understand the current. And when you go back 20 years or 30 years, and think about the domestic violence movement and the grassroots nature of that, and sort of the challenges around even funding programs, let alone funding adequately for staff, it's been a historical movement to provide an essential service that has always been underfunded, right, and undervalued. And even though during COVID, domestic violence programs were labeled an essential service, and essential services are always funded, and my long history of working in a variety of systems, those that are considered essential, criminal justice, public safety, are always adequately funded. So, we look at the salaries, you can see starting salaries for a police officer at like 65,000 across the Commonwealth. That is not the starting salary in any of our domestic violence programs. And so we have to recognize there's some inherent bias built into our challenges around funding, and then think about how do we make it clear the impact, right? Because people think, oh, they're just helping people, but it's so much more transformative than that. And I know in talking to programs recently, it means the fact that we don't have the money that we need to, and we were hoping to get that 5 million last year in the governor's budget, and we got 2.5 in the end, and we really need additional funding. It means that things like cost of living increases don't happen. We all know how much eggs are costing right now. I mean, if food is costing much more and salaries aren't increasing, that is a significant impact as well. And the concept of, as you said earlier, Lauren, the dramatic challenges of the job do mirror other essential services. And they really, ideally, we are able to fund programs well enough, not only to pay them, the staff, what they should be earning, but also to pay them to be able to not just have a living wage, but thrive, things like tuition reimbursement, the ability to have enough people on staff so you're not wearing four different hats. I mean, I worked in a domestic violence program, worked as a paid employee at 19. I was in college, but it was amazing to watch the staff and the number of hats they had to wear. So I think recognizing the need for advocacy, not just focused on we need more money in the budget, but this is an essential service. And there are 59 programs serving all of our counties in Pennsylvania, and they need to be recognized as an essential service.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And Aishwarya even mentions this in her blog too, that pay equity and domestic violence aren't just women's issues, they're public safety issues. And making sure that we think about domestic violence services in that category of essential services and similar to a first responder is really important because historically, I think domestic violence has been viewed by a lot of people as like, oh, that's an individual issue. That's not, that's a private family matter. But really, domestic violence is something that is a community problem. It's a public safety, public health issue that impacts, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men. And is something that we need to think about more collectively and really framing domestic violence services as emergency services, which they are, or essential services, which they are, is, I think, really critical to understanding just how important this work is. It really does save lives, and people's lives truly are at risk if they can't access these kind of services.
And Lauren, can I just say one other thing that kind of on the other side of this, when we talk about pay equity, there's things that state from a policy perspective, of course, there's things that states can do. Other states can't pass transparency legislation so that you see a salary range and it is not based on previous salary, because we know that historically, female identifying individuals are paid less and less and less. And so they go up this chain with less if it's based on, even though they're doing the same exact job. And so states that say, this is the salary, you must post the salary range and it must be public. Things like that help to increase that transparency. And not to be a broken record, I mean, we've been trying for a very long time. First rally I ever went to when I was 10, was for the Equal Rights Amendment, to really just make it clear that that women should always be treated the same in law. And there's just a lot of ways that pay equity is baked into systems. And some of those ways can be addressed with smart public policy that just is usually pretty hard to move in state general assemblies.
Yeah. Well, and on that line of what can be done, Aishwarya, I know in the blog you talk about some strategies to help move us towards pay equity. Can you talk about some of those strategies?
Sure. So there are so many pieces that when we put together can bring pay equity in an organization or through employers. So the first I feel is really important, advocating for paid, safe, and sick leave, which includes leave for illness. It also includes the needed leave for survivor safety, and let's say someone has a range of caregiving needs. So it includes leave for those. We know paid childcare is important because it not only helps share gender norms, it promotes equity in relationships. And we've seen that states that do offer childcare have a smaller pay gap on average. Raising the living wage, actually advocating for a thriving wage, because not only will it help provide someone the basic necessities of life, but also increase a women's economic bargaining power. Thriving wage allows someone to be economic independence. It's not just getting paid for basic necessities like rent, food, housing, but it allows someone to grow their wealth. And I do want to acknowledge that, yes, there have been a lot of turnovers in the recent years at programs, but there are so many ways that we could still bring equity in programs. Like Jenna mentioned, let's start with transparency. Let's start with equitable hiring practices, not asking salary history questions, publishing salary ranges so the cycle of underpay is broken and the current salary of someone is determined based on the role and not on their previous earnings, making sure that we're using consistent job relevant standard set of questions so there's no biases when it comes to interviewing, making sure we're conducting regular audits that can help identify and address pay disparities. So there are so many ways in which we could involve staff, in which we could involve leadership, in which we could involve these organizations to make pay equity a priority.
Thanks, Sharia. And Jenna, anything that you would want to add to that as far as what can we do in Pennsylvania to help ensure that we are moving towards pay equity?
I think conversations are really important. I know lots of people who don't love policy or politics, but the reality is that our state legislators, both representatives and senators, are very accessible. Follow them on Facebook, follow them on Instagram, and really understand what they're talking about, and go to their events and develop relationships. People listen to who shows up and talks to them. They come to understand the issues that people explain to them. I have had longstanding friendships with some legislators, and I would sit in their office, and 1 minute it's ALK licenses. The next person in is SEPTA in Philadelphia. The next issue is fracking, whatever. And so they're not going to be able to be experts in our issues. And we can sit home and be frustrated and tired and overworked trying to, make everything work. Which Crystal are, and we can also develop relationships, send emails, educate. I would say it's important to educate before you ask, because when you show up and just say, this is a problem, I need you to fix it, they're like, well, who are you and how do I know that's really a problem? But when you develop a relationship, they're like, oh, okay, so can you explain that to me again? Because it takes time to learn things. And it's often that it's not that legislators don't care. So they have so many things they're trying to learn and understand, and what is the right solution or the most effective solution. So relationship, I said the most important thing that we can all do is know our local legislators and develop relationships with them in which we are giving information much more than we are asking. So we give lots of information and then we ask.
Thanks so much, Jenna. Yeah, so it sounds like, there's some things that employers can just go ahead and do on their own, and then there's some bigger systems-wide solutions that we can all together advocate for to help improve pay equity and also improve the way that our state invests in domestic violence services, because investing in domestic violence services really does save lives and will help us moving forward and reach pay equity. So thank you both for joining me today on this Equal Pay Day. I just wanted to open it up. Aishwarya, do you have any final thoughts on Equal Pay Day today?
No, I think we've covered it all. Like Jana said, starting the conversation is really important. Let's move beyond just having that awareness that we do need to do something about pay equity, and let's actually start thinking about action steps on how we can incorporate this into our programs, into our organizations.
And Jenna, any final Equal Pay Day thoughts from you?
Don't be afraid to talk to your legislator. While we can absolutely, there are things you can do, but from the public policy perspective, just educate. You don't have to ask, you can just educate. We can start there.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And for folks out there listening, I encourage you to go to PCADV.org. There'll be a link also in the chat on Facebook to read Aishwarya's latest blog about pay equity. Check out our page all about the gender wage gap and how that intersects with domestic violence. And also sign up to become an advocate so that when we have policy action alerts, you'll get those and you'll be able to take those actions and use your voice to stand up for survivors. So thank you very much, everyone. glad to be with you on Equal Pay Day. Bye.